For about 40 years, the standard nutrition advice was that animal fat is bad, dairy fat is worse, and the way to be healthy is to remove both. And for about 40 years, every major heart disease and metabolic disease curve has kept climbing, despite a population that has done its best to follow that advice. That is not a small mismatch. It is one of the largest gaps between dietary policy and population outcomes in modern public health history. Recently, researchers studying a specific fatty acid found in full-fat dairy have started asking whether we got the entire story backwards. This is Dr. Kenzo longevity. The fatty acid in question is called Pentadecanoic acid, written as C15-0. It belongs to a small family of odd-chain fatty acids your body uses, but does not produce in meaningful amounts, so you get it almost entirely from your diet. The richest dietary sources are full-fat dairy from ruminant animals like cows, sheep, and goats, which produce it as part of normal milk fat composition. For decades, nobody paid attention to C15-0 because it was assumed to be inert, a passive marker of dairy fat intake and nothing more. That assumption changed when researchers began measuring C15-0 levels in the blood of large groups of adults and tracking what happened to them over years. The pattern that emerged was unexpected. People with higher C15-0 levels in their plasma had lower rates of metabolic disease, less inflammation, and longer lifespans. The association was strong enough that it appeared in cohort after cohort across different countries and dietary patterns, which is the kind of consistency that draws serious scientific attention. That pattern showed up so consistently that some researchers began describing C15-0 as an essential fatty acid. If accepted, that would be the first proposed addition to the essential fatty acid list in about 90 years, which is not a routine claim in nutrition research. A caveat up front, this video is not promising rapid aging reversal, and it is not telling you to start drinking heavy cream from a milkshake glass. The science here is genuinely interesting, but it is also still developing, and there are caveats in the research that anyone discussing this topic honestly has to mention. What I am going to walk you through is the mechanism C15-0 appears to work through. Then I will name the 3 dairy foods that deliver it most reliably, and finally where the honest scientific limits sit. Quick thing before we go further, if this kind of breakdown is what you have been looking for, subscribe and hit the bell. There's a new video on this channel every day on the next strange thing your body is doing right now. Now back to the mechanism, because you need to understand what C15-0 appears to do at the cellular level before the dietary advice means anything. Your cells are bounded by membranes made primarily of fatty acids. The composition of those membranes affects almost everything the cell does. Think of the membrane as both the wall of the cell and its communication interface. Every signal in and out passes through it. Stiffer, more stable membranes resist damage from oxidation, mechanical stress, and the natural wear that accumulates with age. Membranes that lose stability become leaky and inefficient, which is part of what researchers are referring to when they talk about cellular aging. This is why something as small as a single fatty acid can have outsized effects. The membrane is at the foundation of cellular function, not the periphery. C15-0 appears to integrate into cell membranes in a way that increases their structural stability, which is the first proposed mechanism for its effects. The second proposed mechanism involves activating 2 cellular receptors called PPAR-alpha and PPAR-delta. These receptors regulate how cells use energy and respond to stress, sitting at a control point for several different metabolic pathways. These receptors are involved in mitochondrial function, fatty acid burning, and the broader process of cellular maintenance, all of which slow down with age. When PAR activity declines, cells become less efficient at burning fat for fuel and less responsive to the signals that maintain healthy function. By stimulating those receptors, C15-0 appears to nudge cells toward the kind of behavior we associate with younger, more resilient tissue. A study published in 2020 documented that C15-0 supplementation reduced markers of inflammation and improved cellular function in laboratory models. That work is one of several lines of evidence converging on the same conclusion, that this fatty acid has biological effects beyond simply being a dairy intake marker. Quick question before we go deeper. Tell me in the comments what country you're watching from. The biology is the same everywhere, but the per capita dairy intake varies enormously by country, which means your baseline C15-0 may also vary. And if you have not subscribed yet, this is the moment. What is coming next changes how you will think about a category of food you may have been avoiding for years. Here is the part that connects to the title of this video. The phrase reverse aging is a strong one, and the honest version is more modest than the phrase suggests. What the research actually shows is that higher C15-0 levels are associated with reduced markers of cellular aging. The same higher levels also correlate with the kind of metabolic profile we see in healthier older adults across long-term cohort studies. That is not the same as reversing aging in the dramatic sense. It is more like supporting the conditions under which your cells age more gracefully. And the dietary route to that support is something most people had been told to avoid: full-fat dairy from quality sources. Today, I'm walking you through the 3 dairy foods with the highest C15-0 density and the most realistic role in everyday eating. But before I name the first one, there is one more piece of context that matters, because not all dairy is created equal for this purpose. The C15-0 content of dairy depends heavily on how the animal was fed, with pasture-raised and grass-fed ruminants producing higher concentrations than grain-fed counterparts. That difference is meaningful enough that some researchers consider it a key variable, and it is worth knowing when you're choosing what to buy. When you can find dairy labeled grass-fed or pasture-raised, it is genuinely a different product nutritionally from standard conventional dairy. The difference is not huge per serving, but across daily consumption over years, it adds up to a meaningfully different exposure. Now let me walk you through the 3 foods, in order of practicality and density. Food number 1 is full-fat plain yogurt, ideally from grass-fed or pasture-raised sources when available. Yogurt earns the top spot because it combines C15-0 from the dairy fat with the probiotic bacteria from fermentation, supporting both cellular and gut health at once. The fermentation process also predigests some of the lactose, which makes yogurt better tolerated by people who do not handle plain milk well. A study from a European research group documented that regular consumption of fermented dairy was associated with lower inflammation and improved metabolic markers in long-term cohorts. The fermented dairy effect appears to be larger than the unfermented dairy effect in several of these studies, suggesting the bacteria contribute something on top of the fatty acid itself. That makes yogurt a particularly efficient choice. You get both effects in a single food: the C15-0 from the dairy fat and the probiotic benefit from the culture. The practical application for yogurt: a serving of plain full-fat yogurt most days, ideally without added sugar, used as a base for berries, nuts, or seeds. Avoid low-fat and zero-fat versions for this purpose because the C15-0 you are looking for lives in the fat, and removing the fat removes the point. Food number 2 is aged hard cheese, specifically varieties like cheddar, Gouda, Parmesan, Gruyere, and Pecorino. Aged cheese is dense in dairy fat by weight, and the aging process concentrates that fat further as moisture is reduced over months. A single ounce of aged cheddar or Parmesan contains a meaningful dose of C15-0, and the higher fat density makes it efficient on a per gram basis. Aged cheeses are also lower in lactose than fresh dairy, because much of the lactose is consumed by the bacteria during the aging process. That makes them more tolerable for many people who have difficulty with plain milk or other fresh dairy products. A study from a long-term cohort published in a major journal found that regular cheese consumption was not associated with the cardiovascular harm that earlier nutritional advice had assumed. In fact, the same study found that moderate cheese intake correlated with neutral or slightly favorable cardiovascular outcomes, depending on the specific subgroup analyzed. This was a meaningful update to the older view, because cheese had been on the avoid list for decades based on its saturated fat content alone. The newer research suggests that the matrix of the food matters. Fat eaten as cheese behaves differently from the same amount of fat eaten as butter on toast. The practical application for aged cheese: a moderate portion several times a week, ideally as part of a meal rather than as a separate snack. A reasonable amount is roughly 1 to 2 ounces per serving, paired with vegetables, whole grains, or as part of a salad. Quick thing, what I just covered is the surface. There is a complete protocol that takes everything you just heard and turns it into something you actually do every day. It is called Reset, the 14-day brain reboot. Day by day, instructions, exact dosages, timing windows, and the science behind each one explained the same way I just walked through cell membrane fatty acids. Built around the same biological systems covered on this channel: cellular metabolism, mitochondrial function, and the daily routines that support these systems. The 14-day timeline is structured so you can measure your own changes, energy, recovery, and general resilience as visible indicators. Less than $10 for the entire protocol, less than the cost of a single coffee per day across 2 weeks, with lifetime access included automatically. First link in the description below this video, but stay here because the third food and the honest limits of this science matter. Food number 3 is grass-fed butter, and this is the most contrarian inclusion on the list. For decades, butter was framed as the worst possible dairy choice, the concentrated fat of an already suspect food category. And yet the science on this question is more nuanced than that framing ever acknowledged, with newer studies arriving at very different conclusions. Grass-fed butter is dense in C15-0 precisely because it is concentrated dairy fat. It comes from ruminants raised on the food source, fresh pasture, that maximizes the fatty acid content in the first place. A study published in a respected nutrition journal found no consistent association between moderate butter intake and cardiovascular disease, contradicting decades of earlier assumptions. A larger meta-analysis, combining results from multiple cohort studies, reached a similar conclusion, that the previously assumed link was much weaker than originally claimed. That does not mean butter is health food in unlimited amounts, but it does mean that moderate intake of grass-fed butter is unlikely to be harmful for most people. The practical application for grass-fed butter, modest amounts used in cooking or on whole foods, ideally replacing more refined fat sources rather than added on top. A teaspoon to a tablespoon at a meal is reasonable, used on vegetables with eggs or in moderate cooking, rather than slathered on bread in large quantities. Quick observation, if you have made it this far, you already understand more about cell membrane biology than 90% of adults. The Reset protocol takes that understanding and gives it shape over 14 days, first link in the description, less than $10 for the complete sequence. And if this kind of breakdown is what you have been looking for, subscribe. Now stay with me, because the honest limits of this science are critical. Let me explain how the three foods work together before we get to the limits. Full-fat yogurt provides the daily base, fermented and tolerable, delivering C15-0 alongside probiotic bacteria that support gut health. Aged cheese provides the concentrated dose, dense in fat by weight and lower in lactose, contributing meaningfully to the total C15-0 load. Grass-fed butter provides the cooking and seasoning fat, replacing refined oils with a source that delivers the fatty acid in modest daily amounts. Together, these three sources can meaningfully shift the C15-0 level in your plasma over weeks and months without requiring large changes to how you eat. The shift is not dramatic in any single day. It is the cumulative effect of moving from low-fat dairy or no dairy to moderate full-fat dairy as a steady daily pattern over many weeks. For people who were already avoiding dairy entirely, even modest reintroduction can produce a measurable change, since baseline levels in those people are often very low. But here's where I have to be more honest than most channels will be about this topic. Much of the most enthusiastic C15-0 research has been published by or in collaboration with a company that sells a C15-0 supplement. That is not a reason to dismiss the findings outright, but it is a real conflict of interest that anyone serious about this topic has to acknowledge. When a single company funds or co-authors much of the research on a nutrient it sells, you have to interpret enthusiastic claims with extra caution. The history of nutrition science is full of nutrients that looked promising in industry-funded research, and then disappointed in independent replications. Independent research is still developing, and the long-term effects of deliberately raising C15-0 through diet or supplementation are not fully characterized yet. What is well supported is the observational pattern. Higher C15-0 levels correlate with better metabolic markers and lower inflammation in large populations. What is less established is whether actively raising your level produces the same benefits and whether food sources or supplements work equally well for that purpose. The reasonable interpretation is that full-fat dairy from quality sources, in moderate amounts, is probably not the dietary villain it was made out to be. That alone is a meaningful change from 40 years of contrary advice, and it is a finding worth taking seriously without overstating it. The title of this video uses the phrase reverse aging, and the honest version is that these foods may modestly support the conditions under which your cells age more gracefully. That is a worthwhile effect, but it is gradual and modest. It works alongside the rest of your diet, your sleep, and your activity, not as a standalone fountain of youth that overrides everything else. 3 common mistakes I want you to avoid before changing anything tomorrow morning. Mistake 1, choosing low-fat or zero-fat dairy for this purpose, which removes exactly the fatty acid you're trying to consume in the first place. Mistake 2, dramatically increasing dairy intake based on this single nutrient, when total calories and overall diet quality still matter more than any one fatty acid. Mistake 3, treating C15-0 supplements as proven when the independent science is still developing and food sources are better characterized. One thing before this video closes, the broader lesson here is about how nutritional consensus changes over time. It is striking how easy it has been to be wrong about an entire category of food for decades, and worth holding that lesson in mind on other dietary questions. The willingness to revise advice when the evidence shifts is what separates good science from accumulated dogma, and this is a clear case of evidence shifting. If this video clicked for you, subscribe. There's a new video on this channel every day on the next strange thing your body is doing right now. And if you want the full Reset 14-day protocol, day by day, with dosages and timing, first link below. Less than $10, less than a single coffee per day for 2 weeks. Your body is running software that has not been updated in 200,000 years. Tomorrow's video is about something connected to everything we just covered. It works on the same cellular system, but in a direction you will not expect. That is next.